So I'm just going to talk a little bit and tell you about the work that I've been doing. I'm an architect and a planner, and for the last 10 years or so I've been working on projects that we would talk about as being in the public realm in New York. And by that I mean what's out there, what's between the buildings, the sidewalks, the streets, parks, connection between all of those things, how you get from one place to another. Not the MTA, that's somebody else's responsibility, that wasn't mine. But I worked for about 7 years under the Bloomberg administration in the Department of Transportation, bringing you bike share and all of those wonderful new bike lanes, and Times Square, which I'll talk about in a minute, as one of those issues of democracy and public space. But in terms of the areas that I've been thinking about as an architect, I've for many years was working on actually doing buildings and more sculptural sorts of objects that would hold the things the projects that we just looked at. As I moved more into looking at the public realm, you think about what goes on the street, what do you do in the street, how do you get from one place to another, what is that experience like, and what are the surfaces that you walk on, how do you make that better, how do you make it legible to people so they can walk around, signage, lights, how do you keep people safe from automobiles and also from other bicyclists and other people that are using the streets. So I thought about that issue for a lot of years, and one of the major projects that I worked on while I was with the city was Times Square. And I worked with a team that planned Times Square. We designed the closure, and if you've been in New York over the last few months, there's a lot of controversy going on right now about who uses public space, how it's used, how people are protected in that, and we can sort of discuss that if you have questions. But I think it's the politics of that are hugely fascinating if you've been following it, about how what's the role of the police, what's the public allowed to do, and also the intersection with First Amendment issues, which have to do with freedom of speech, who's allowed to do what in the street. So architecture and planning have a kind of intersection with all of those political issues, which are really fascinating to deal with. My most recent role at the Municipal Art Society was really dealing with more of the political side.
One of those issues you have to deal with.
Noise is another issue that we deal with. But one of the things that concerns all of us as citizens in New York is what gets built, how it gets built, who controls what gets built. And so as an advocacy organization, which is outside of city government, so I moved out of city government into what's called a civil society organization, you get to work between politicians, developers, and community groups. So talking about what's the best thing to build here, advocating for the right position, working with groups like No Longer Empty to facilitate some of the great cultural experiments that are going on around the city. So we look at what developers are doing, how things are connected by transportation issues, what are the large sort of issues that determine how our city is shaped, how it's built, and engaging people like you who should be hopefully engaged in all of the building that goes on in the city, because that's the most important part of the city is you. And so hoping to, in my work going forward, and to educate people in terms of how you talk about the issues in the city, how you become engaged in those issues, and how you make the city a better place for all of you. So I'm happy to answer questions. I didn't really prepare a presentation in terms of the work. The Times Square, just going back to that for a minute, I think is one of the more interesting issues recently, because under the Bloomberg administration, the goal was to have to create new public spaces for people where there weren't they didn't have public space to gather, so there are almost, I think, 80 at this point all over the 5 boroughs. Not Times Square is the biggest and the most public, but there are 80 of them around the city that people can gather in. Neighborhood groups manage them. They have events and they have cultural events in the neighborhoods. There's sculpture, there's artists that work in those public spaces. So those public spaces are created for the neighborhoods and the communities. So Times Square is actually an interesting one in that it's kind of created for, it's a much larger community that uses it. There are probably 400,000 people that go through there every day, and many of them, if you walk through Times Square, which I hope all of you do, there's many, many languages spoken there. There's many, many interests that are going on there. There's lots of different cultures that come together there. So it's one of the largest sort of public gathering spaces that there is in New York. And so it's the argument over how that space should be used is really critical to all of our kind of democratic ideals and how we would like to see our city formed. So there was some threat by the current police commissioner and even the mayor that we're going to take those plazas out because they're causing so much trouble. The argument on the other side that I've made with many of the people that I worked with is that you don't fix something by taking it away, you fix it by figuring out how to manage it and govern it. So that's our job going forward. So I'm happy to answer questions afterwards when we talk about it.